February 17, 1919. New York City. Fifth Avenue is packed with over 1 million people. The largest crowd in the city's history. They're waiting for heroes. And here they come, marching in perfect formation, a regiment of soldiers in French helmets and American uniforms, their chests covered with medals. But these aren't just any soldiers. They're black men, members of the 369th Infantry Regiment. The crowd goes wild. Ticker tape rains down. Women throw flowers. Children wave flags. For one glorious day, these men are celebrated as the heroes they are. For one day, America remembers that they spent 191 consecutive days in combat, longer than any other American unit. For one day, their skin color doesn't matter. But tomorrow, they'll take off their uniforms and return to America, where they can't vote in many states, where they can't eat in most restaurants, where they're still second-class citizens in the country they nearly died defending. This is the story of the Harlem Hellfighters, the 369th Infantry Regiment. They were America's most decorated regiment in World War I, receiving more medals than any other American unit. They never lost a foot of ground to the enemy. They never had a man captured. They spent more continuous time in combat than any other American regiment. But the U.S. Army didn't want them. White officers refused to serve with them. The American command wouldn't let them fight alongside white troops. So they were loaned to the French army, where they became legendary. Their story is about extraordinary courage in battle. But it's also about fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the German Empire and one against racism in their own country. It's about men who were asked to fight for freedoms they themselves didn't have. And it's about how they proved their worth in the face of a nation that refused to acknowledge it. For decades, the Harlem Hellfighters story was forgotten, deliberately erased from many American history books. Their incredible achievements were downplayed or ignored. The racism they faced was swept under the rug. It's only in recent years that their story has begun to receive the attention it deserves. This isn't just a story about the past. It's about how America has always asked black citizens to sacrifice for a country that hasn't fully embraced them. It's about the gap between America's ideals and its reality. And it's about the courage of people who fought for those ideals anyway, hoping that someday America would live up to them. Today, we're going to tell the complete story. The heroism and the racism, the triumphs and betrayals, the glory and the injustice. This is the story America should have been telling all along. The story of the Harlem Hellfighters. To understand the Harlem Hellfighters, we need to understand America in 1917. This was an America where segregation was a law across the South and the practice throughout much of the North. An America where lynchings of black people were common. Over 3,000 had occurred since the Civil War, often with the participation or tacit approval of local authorities. Black Americans had limited economic opportunities, virtually no political power, and faced daily humiliation and violence. The promises of Reconstruction had been betrayed. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, supposed to guarantee freedom, citizenship, and voting rights, were being systematically undermined by state laws, court decisions, and terrorism. Yet black Americans still believed in America's ideals, even when America didn't live up to them. Leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois argued that black military service could prove black citizenship and earn respect. If black men fought for democracy abroad, surely they would be granted democracy at home. When America declared war on Germany in April 1917, black leaders saw opportunity. This would be a chance to prove black patriotism and courage. This would be a war to make the world safe for democracy. Surely that democracy would extend to black Americans who fought for it. But the U.S. military had other ideas. The Army was rigidly segregated. Black soldiers were relegated to colored units, almost always commanded by white officers. The military establishment believed black men were inferior soldiers, cowardly, incompetent, and unsuitable for combat. Most black soldiers were assigned to labor battalions, doing manual work behind the lines. They would load supplies, dig trenches, and bury the dead, but they wouldn't be allowed to fight. There was one exception. The 369th Infantry Regiment, originally formed as the 15th New York National Guard Regiment in 1916. This unit was different. It was raised in Harlem, the heart of black New York. Its soldiers were volunteers, men who wanted to fight for their country despite knowing how their country treated them. And they would get their chance to prove what black soldiers could do. The regiment that would become the Harlem Hellfighters began in 1916, before America entered the war. New York's governor authorized the formation of a colored National Guard regiment, the 15th New York. Recruiting was led by Colonel William Hayward, a white lawyer and politician who genuinely believed in the potential of black soldiers. Hayward went to Harlem, which was rapidly becoming the center of black culture and life in New York, to find his soldiers. The response was extraordinary. Despite facing discrimination in every aspect of civilian life, black men volunteered enthusiastically. They saw military service as a path to dignity and respect. They believed that if they fought for America, America would finally treat them as full citizens. Among the recruits were men from all walks of life. There were college graduates and illiterate laborers, porters, waiters, janitors, and students, men from middle-class families and men from poverty. They were united by their blackness, their patriotism, and their determination to prove themselves. But from the beginning, they faced obstacles. The U.S. Army refused to provide them with weapons or equipment. White National Guard armories wouldn't allow them to train on their premises. They had to drill with broomsticks instead of rifles. They trained in a dingy, inadequate armory in Manhattan. When war was declared in April 1917, the 15th New York was mobilized, but they still weren't given real equipment. While white regiments received modern Springfield rifles, the 15th got nothing. While white units trained at established military bases, the 15th was shunted to a makeshift camp with inadequate facilities. The message was clear. The Army didn't want black combat soldiers. The 15th New York was an embarrassment to be hidden away. But Colonel Hayward and his men refused to give up. They trained harder with their inadequate resources. They maintained discipline and pride. They waited for their chance. That chance would come in France. Before we continue with the military story, we need to talk about the band, because the 369th Infantry Regiment band became almost as famous as the fighters themselves. Colonel Hayward recruited James Reese Europe, one of the most important figures in early jazz, to lead the regiment's band. Europe was already famous in black musical circles, having helped establish jazz as an art form. Europe recruited the finest black musicians he could find. His band included some of the best jazz and ragtime players in America. They brought a new sound, American jazz, to Europe for the first time. When the 369th went to France, their band went with them. Between battles, they performed for French civilians and soldiers. The French had never heard anything like it, this infectious, swinging, improvised music. Jazz captivated Europe. The band became cultural ambassadors, breaking down racial barriers through music. French audiences didn't care about the musician's skin color. They just loved the music. For many white Americans in France, it was the first time they saw black men treated with genuine respect and admiration. The band also provided morale for the soldiers. Between brutal combat rotations, the music reminded them of home, lifted their spirits, and reinforced their pride. They weren't just soldiers. They were representatives of black American culture, showing the world what black artistry could achieve. Lieutenant Europe and his band helped change music history. When they returned to America, they introduced jazz to wider audiences, helping launch the jazz age of the 1920s. But first, they had a war to fight. In December 1917, the 15th New York, soon to be redesignated as the 369th Infantry Regiment, arrived in France. They expected to join American forces and finally prove themselves in combat. Instead, they were immediately assigned to labor duty. The American command, reflecting the racism of the era, insisted that black soldiers weren't fit for combat. The 369th was ordered to unload ships, build roads, and dig latrines. It was humiliating. These were trained soldiers who had volunteered to fight, now being used as common laborers. They watched white American units, many less trained than they were, march off to the front lines while they dug ditches. But then something changed. The American Expeditionary Force, commanded by General John J. Pershing, had a problem. The AF was training to fight as an independent American army, But the French desperately needed reinforcements. They'd been bleeding for nearly 4 years. The French asked for American units to temporarily attach to French divisions. Pershing didn't want to break up his army, but he had these black regiments that he didn't want fighting alongside white American troops anyway. So he made a decision that would change history. He would loan several black regiments, including the 369th, to the French army. The Americans got rid of units they didn't want. The French got desperately needed reinforcements. And the soldiers of the 369th finally got their chance to fight. On April 8, 1918, the 369th Infantry Regiment was formally attached to the French 16th Division. They were issued French equipment, including the excellent French Lebel rifles and Chauchat automatic weapons. They were given French helmets, the distinctive Adrian helmet that would become part of their iconic image. And they were treated for the first time as real soldiers. The French didn't care about the color of their skin. France had its own racial issues, but had long recruited colonial troops from Africa and Asia. The French military judged soldiers by their performance, not their race. The men of the 369th were stunned to be treated with basic respect and dignity. Now, they just had to prove they could fight. In April 1918, the 369th Infantry entered the trenches for the first time, taking over position in a quiet sector to get acclimated to front-line conditions. They were nervous but eager. Finally, after months of humiliation, they would get to prove themselves. On May 14, 1918, they got their chance, and it came in the form of a German raid. That night, 2 soldiers from the 369th, Private Henry Johnson and Private Needham Roberts, were on sentry duty in an isolated listening post. Around 2 a.m., they heard wire cutters. Germans were cutting through the barbed wire, trying to infiltrate the Allied trenches to capture prisoners for interrogation. Johnson and Roberts opened fire. A raiding party of at least 12 German soldiers rushed their position. Roberts was hit by a grenade and went down wounded. German soldiers swarmed over the position, tried to drag Roberts away as a prisoner. Henry Johnson's rifle jammed. He was out of ammunition. German soldiers were on top of him. In that moment, Johnson became legend. He grabbed a BOLO knife, a large machete-like blade, and attacked. He slashed and stabbed with savage desperation. When Germans tried to drag Roberts away, Johnson went after them, fighting multiple soldiers hand-to-hand in the dark. The fight lasted only minutes but felt like hours. Johnson was wounded multiple times, 21 wounds in total from bullets, grenades, and bayonets, but he kept fighting. Finally, French reinforcements arrived and the Germans retreated, leaving behind weapons, equipment, and several dead. When the sun rose, the full extent of what had happened became clear. Johnson and Roberts had single-handedly defeated a German raiding party, prevented any American capture, and inflicted significant enemy casualties. Johnson had fought off the enemy with a knife when his rifle failed. It was extraordinary courage. The French immediately awarded both men the Croix de Guerre, France's highest military honor. They became the first American soldiers in World War I to receive foreign decorations for bravery. The story made headlines worldwide. Suddenly, the 369th Infantry Regiment was famous, and Henry Johnson, a black man from Albany, New York, who had been a railroad porter, became one of the most celebrated soldiers of World War I. The Battle of Johnson and Roberts shattered racist stereotypes. Here was proof that black soldiers were not cowards. Here was evidence that they could fight as well as any white soldier, perhaps better. The 369th had drawn first blood, and they had proven their worth. But this was just the beginning. The real test was yet to come. After their early success, the 369th was moved to more active sectors of the Western Front. Throughout the summer and fall of 1918, they were in almost constant combat, holding trenches, repelling attacks, and participating in offensives. The Western Front in 1918 was industrial-scale slaughter. Artillery barges could last for days. Machine guns created killing zones where advancing soldiers were mowed down by the hundreds. Poison gas drifted through trenches, burning lungs and eyes. The landscape was a moonscape of shell craters, barbed wire, and mud. The men of the 369th experienced all of it. They lived in trenches filled with rats, lice, and the smell of death. They went days without sleep. They watched friends die in front of them. They endured artillery bombardments that could drive men insane. They charged machine gun positions that cut their ranks to pieces. And they kept fighting. Unlike most American units, which were rotated out of combat regularly, the 369th stayed on the line for 191 consecutive days, longer than any other American regiment. They were never relieved, never given extended rest. The French needed them too desperately. The racism they had faced in America made them determined to prove themselves. They couldn't afford to fail. Failure would be used as evidence of black inferiority. Every battle was not just against the Germans, but against the prejudice that said black men couldn't fight. So they fought harder than they had to. They took casualties they could have avoided. They volunteered for dangerous missions. They never retreated, never surrendered, never let the enemy take ground. Their motto was, "God damn, let's go." And they lived by it. The French noticed. Unlike American commanders, who often disparaged black soldiers in official reports, French commanders praised the 369th in the highest terms. They noted the unit's discipline, courage, and combat effectiveness. French soldiers fought alongside them with respect and admiration. One French commander wrote, "These men lack only one thing to make them splendid soldiers: white skins." It was a backhanded compliment. Even progressive French officers couldn't escape racial thinking, but it showed that the 369th had overcome the presumption of black military inferiority. They were proving one battle at a time that courage and competence had nothing to do with skin color. In September 1918, the Allies launched their final major offensive of the war, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. It would be the largest American battle of World War I, involving over 1 million American soldiers fighting to break German lines and end the war. The 369th Infantry, still attached to the French, participated in the offensive's eastern flank. Their objective was to push through heavily fortified German positions in the Argonne Forest, some of the strongest offenses on the Western Front. On September 26, the offensive began with the largest artillery barrage in American military history. For hours, thousands of guns pounded German positions. Then, at dawn, the infantry went over the top. The 369th advanced into hell. German artillery responded with devastating counter-battery fire. Machine gun positions that had survived the bombardment opened up, cutting down advancing soldiers. The Germans had prepared these defenses for years. Bunkers, barbed wire, interlocking fields of fire. The 369th attacked across open ground swept by machine gun fire. Men fell by the dozens, but the rest kept going. When they reached German trenches, the fighting became hand-to-hand. Rifles, grenades, bayonets, and knives. It was savage, brutal combat at close range. But they took their objectives. Position by position, trench by trench, the 369th drove the Germans back. When they encountered a strong point they couldn't assault directly, they called for artillery support and then attacked through the bombardment. When German counterattacks threatened to overwhelm them, they held firm and fought them off. The casualties were horrific. In the first days of the offensive, the 369th lost hundreds of men killed or wounded. Units were decimated and had to be reorganized. Officers were killed and sergeants took command. Companies were reduced to the size of platoons. But they never broke. They never retreated. When French units on their flanks were forced back, the 369th held its position, protecting the exposed flanks. When they were ordered to advance, they advanced, regardless of casualties. One soldier, Private Elmer McCowan, single-handedly captured a German machine gun nest that was holding up the advance. He charged the position alone, killed the crew with his rifle and grenades, and turned the captured machine gun on retreating Germans. He was awarded the French Croix de Guerre for this action. The fighting continued for weeks. Advance, dig in, repel counterattack, advance again. The 369th pushed deeper into German territory, taking fortified villages and strategic positions. They fought through rain, mud, and exhaustion. They fought through gas attacks that left men vomiting and choking. They fought until they literally could not stand. By November, the German army was collapsing. The 369th was still advancing, still fighting, when on November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. The war was over. The 369th Infantry Regiment had been in combat for 191 consecutive days. They had advanced further than almost any other Allied unit in their sector. They had never lost a foot of ground to the enemy. They had never had a man captured. And they had earned more French decorations than any other American unit. 171 individual Croix de Guerre awards and a unit citation. They had proven, beyond any doubt, that black soldiers were equal to any encouraged discipline and effectiveness. They had written one of the most heroic chapters in American military history. But would America acknowledge it? The contrast between how the French and Americans treated the 369th was stark and disturbing. The French genuinely respected the black soldiers. French commanders praised them in official reports. French soldiers shared trenches with them without complaint. French civilians welcomed them into their homes and villages. French women danced with them at town celebrations. For many men of the 369th, it was the first time in their lives they had been treated as full human beings by white people. They could eat in French restaurants. They could walk French streets without fear. They could socialize with white French people as equals. It was a revelation. But the American military command was disturbed by this fraternization. In August 1918, while the 369th was still fighting on the front lines, American headquarters issued a secret document to French military authorities, secret information concerning black American troops. This document is one of the most shameful official papers in American military history. It warned French commanders and civilians not to treat black American soldiers with too much respect. It claimed that black soldiers were inferior, dangerous, and should be kept segregated. It specifically warned against allowing intimacy between black soldiers and French women. The document essentially told the French, don't treat these men as equals, even though they're fighting and dying for the Allied cause. The French were appalled. Many French officers ignored the directive entirely. But the document reveals the depths of American racism. Even as black soldiers were proving their courage and competence in battle, American authorities were trying to ensure they would remain second class. White American soldiers in France often harassed and attacked black soldiers when they encountered them behind the lines. Black soldiers couldn't use the same recreational facilities, couldn't attend the same events, couldn't socialize in the same spaces. The U.S. Army enforced segregation even in the war zone. When the war ended and American units began preparing to return home, the 369th was once again assigned to labor duty, cleaning up battlefields, burying the dead, dismantling equipment. While white soldiers relaxed and celebrated victory, black soldiers worked. It was a bitter reminder they were still black in America's eyes. Their heroism was acknowledged only when it was useful. Once the fighting was over, they were back to being laborers. But there was one thing the Army couldn't take away: their record. The 369th Infantry Regiment had compiled one of the most distinguished combat records in American military history. No amount of racism could erase that, and when they finally did return to America, they would receive at least one day of recognition they deserved. Before we move to their homecoming, we need to acknowledge the cost of their service. The 369th Infantry Regiment suffered approximately 1,500 casualties, about 75% of their strength. Hundreds of men were killed in action. Hundreds more were wounded, many permanently disabled. Some were disfigured by burns or shrapnel. Others lost limbs. Many suffer from what we would now call PTSD, shell shock, nightmares, flashbacks. These were young men, many in their early 20s, some teenagers. They had volunteered to fight for a country that treated them as inferiors. They had endured discrimination, risked their lives, watched friends die, and suffered wounds that would affect them for the rest of their lives. And they did it knowing that when they returned home, they would go back to segregation, discrimination, and violence. They would be expected to resume their place as second-class citizens. They couldn't vote in many states. They couldn't get good jobs. They faced the constant threat of racist violence. The psychological cost was perhaps even greater than the physical. These men had experienced being treated as equals by the French military and civilians. They had proven their worth in the most extreme circumstances. They had been decorated for heroism by a European nation. How could they go back to drinking from colored water fountains? How could they accept being called boy by white men who had never faced combat? How could they tolerate a system that denied their humanity after they had proven it so dramatically? They couldn't, and many wouldn't. The Harlem Hellfighters would return to America changed, no longer willing to accept the status quo. Their service would become part of the foundation for the civil rights movement that would eventually challenge American apartheid. On February 17, 1919, the 369th Infantry Regiment marched up Fifth Avenue in New York City in a victory parade. Over 1 million people, the largest crowd in New York history to that point, lined the streets to welcome them home. It was a moment of pure triumph. The regiment marched in perfect formation, wearing their French helmets and displaying their medals. Their band, led by Lieutenant James Reese Europe, played jazz and military marches. The crowd went wild with celebration. When the regiment reached Harlem at 130th Street, something extraordinary happened. The white officers who had led them stepped aside. Colonel Hayward gave command to the black officers and NCOs. From 130th Street to 145th Street, through the heart of Harlem, the regiment was led entirely by black men. The symbolism was powerful. Here, in their own community, these men marched as leaders. Harlem's residents poured into the streets. Families cheered for sons, husbands, and fathers. Children waved flags. Women threw flowers. It was a moment of pure black pride and joy. Private Henry Johnson, the hero of the German raid, still recovering from his 21 wounds, rode in an open car at the front of the parade. The crowd chanted his name. He was mobbed by admirers. For that day, he was the most celebrated man in New York. The parade took 5 hours. The celebration continued into the night. For one glorious day, America celebrated its black heroes without reservation. For one day, the color lines seemed to blur. But even at the moment of triumph, there were signs of what was to come. Some white newspapers covered the parade with barely disguised resentment. Some white politicians expressed discomfort with all the attention being given to black soldiers. And across the South, white supremacists watched with alarm as black veterans returned home with military training, medals for valor, and a new sense of their own worth. The celebration wouldn't last. Within months, America would experience the worst outbreak of anti-black violence in its history, and the Harlem Hellfighters would be among its victims. 1919 became known as the Red Summer because of the blood shed in race riots across America. From April through October, white mobs attacked black communities in over 30 cities and towns, killing hundreds of black people and destroying black-owned businesses and homes. The violence was partly a backlash against black veterans. White supremacists were threatened by black men who had military training, who had been treated as equals by Europeans, and who returned with a new sense of dignity and unwillingness to accept second-class status. Black veterans were specifically targeted. In some southern towns, black men were attacked for wearing their uniforms in public. It was seen as uppity behavior. Several black veterans were lynched, some while still in uniform. The message was clear. Your service doesn't matter. You're still black, and you need to know your place. Henry Johnson, the most celebrated soldier in the 369th, faced a particularly cruel fate. Despite his heroism and his wounds, he couldn't find decent work. His injuries prevented him from doing physical labor, but discrimination prevented him from getting other jobs. He was reduced to working as a menial laborer despite being one of America's most decorated soldiers. Johnson developed alcoholism, likely suffering from what we would now recognize as PTSD and depression. His marriage fell apart. His wounds never properly healed. In 1929, at the age of 32, Henry Johnson died poor, broken, and largely forgotten. He was buried in an unmarked grave. The nation that had briefly celebrated him as a hero had discarded him when he was no longer useful. It would be 86 years before the U.S. Army officially recognized his heroism with a Medal of Honor, awarded posthumously in 2015 by President Barack Obama. Other members of the 369th faced similar discrimination. They couldn't get jobs commensurate with their abilities. They faced violence if they tried to exercise their rights. They watched as their wartime service was forgotten or minimized, but they didn't accept it quietly. Black veterans became leaders in the emerging civil rights movement. They had faced German machine guns. They weren't going to be intimidated by Jim Crow. Organizations like the NAACP saw membership surge as veterans joined. The seeds of the modern civil rights movement were planted by men who had proven their worth on European battlefields and refused to be treated as inferior at home. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s, the flowering of black culture, art, music, and literature, was partly fueled by the confidence that came from the wartime experience. The men of the 369th had shown that black Americans could excel at anything. Now, black artists, writers, and musicians would show it again in civilian life. James Reese Europe, the 369th's bandleader, continued to revolutionize American music after the war, until he was tragically murdered by a mentally ill band member in 1919. But his influence lived on, helping to create the jazz age that would define the 1920s. The Harlem Hellfighters had won the war. Now they would help win the peace by refusing to accept injustice. For decades after World War I, the story of the Harlem Hellfighters was largely forgotten or suppressed in mainstream American history. History books focused on white American units. Films about World War I featured only white soldiers. When black soldiers were mentioned at all, it was usually in the context of labor battalions, not combat units. This erasure was deliberate. Acknowledging black soldiers' heroism would undermine the racist ideology that justified segregation. If black men could fight and die for America with distinction, how could you justify denying them equal rights? Better to simply pretend they hadn't served at all or minimize their contributions. The veterans of the 369th fought this erasure. They formed veterans organizations, held reunions, and told their stories to anyone who would listen. They lobbied for recognition, for proper benefits, for the respect they had earned. But mainstream white America largely ignored them. It wasn't until the civil rights movement of the 1960s that the story began to resurface. As America was forced to confront its racist history, the story of black soldiers who had fought for a country that denied them rights became powerful. The Harlem Hellfighters became symbols of both black patriotism and American hypocrisy. In 1986, a memorial was erected in New York honoring the 369th Infantry Regiment. In 1996, France awarded the regiment a collective Croix de Guerre. In 2014, the regiment, still existing as a National Guard unit, received the Congressional Gold Medal. Individual members of the 369th have slowly received recognition. Henry Johnson's Medal of Honor in 2015. Freddie Stowers, who was killed while assaulting a German position in September 1918, received a posthumous Medal of Honor in 1991, 73 years after his death. The French government has worked to identify and honor all 369th recipients of the Croix de Guerre, but recognition is incomplete. Most Americans still don't know the story. The Harlem Hellfighters aren't taught in most schools. Their achievements aren't part of the standard American narrative about World War I. This needs to change. The story of the 369th Infantry Regiment is not a footnote. It's central to understanding American history. It reveals the contradictions at America's heart. A nation that proclaims equality while practicing discrimination, that celebrates heroes selectively based on race, that asks for sacrifice while denying rights. The Harlem Hellfighters story is uncomfortable for America because it forces us to confront these contradictions. But that's exactly why it needs to be told. The military legacy of the 369th Infantry Regiment is profound. They proved definitively and irrefutably that black soldiers could fight as effectively as any other soldiers when given the opportunity, proper training, and adequate equipment. This had ripple effects throughout American military history. In World War II, black soldiers again fought with distinction, despite continued segregation. The Tuskegee Airmen, the 92nd Infantry Division, and numerous other black units compiled heroic records. Each generation of black soldiers built on the foundation laid by the Harlem Hellfighters. In 1948, President Harry Truman ordered the integration of the U.S. Armed Forces. It was a revolutionary change, partly driven by the undeniable record of black military service. You couldn't ask men to fight and die for America while keeping them segregated. The Harlem Hellfighters had helped make that argument impossible to ignore. Today, Black Americans serve in all branches of the military at all ranks, including at the highest levels. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has been Black. Service Academy commanders have been Black. Combat commanders in every war since World War II have been Black. This was unthinkable in 1917. The Harlem Hellfighters helped make it possible. The 369th Infantry Regiment still exists today as a National Guard unit based in Harlem. Its members carry on the tradition of the original Harlem Hellfighters, maintaining that legacy of excellence and service. The cultural legacy of the Harlem Hellfighters extends far beyond military history. They became symbols of Black excellence, pride, and resistance to oppression. The regiment's band, led by James Reese Europe, helped introduce jazz to international audiences. When they performed in France, they weren't just entertaining. They were demonstrating Black American cultural achievement. Jazz would become America's greatest cultural export, and the 369th Infantry Band was crucial to its spread. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s drew inspiration from the Harlem Hellfighters. Here were Black men who had conquered Europe, not through subjugation like European colonial powers, but through heroism and artistry. If Black soldiers and musicians could triumph in Europe, Black artists and writers could triumph anywhere. The image of the Harlem Hellfighter, proud, dignified, heroic, became an icon in Black communities. Photographs of the regiment adorned homes. Stories of their exploits were passed down through families. They represented what Black Americans could achieve when given the opportunity. In modern times, the Hellfighters have been featured in books, documentaries, and graphic novels. A planned film has been in development for years. Their story resonates because it combines heroism with injustice, celebrating achievement while condemning the racism that tried to suppress it. The Harlem Hellfighters remind us that Black Americans have always been patriots, have always served their country with distinction, even when that country didn't serve them back. What lessons does the story of the Harlem Hellfighters hold for us today? First, patriotism is not the monopoly of any race. Black Americans have served and sacrificed to this country since its founding, in the Revolution, the Civil War, and every war since. Yet they have often been treated as less than full citizens. True patriotism means acknowledging and addressing this injustice. Second, representation matters. When the 369th finally got the chance to fight, they proved all the racist stereotypes wrong. But they needed that chance first. How much talent, how much potential has America wasted by denying opportunities based on race? The same question applies today across every field. Third, recognition and justice shouldn't take a century. Henry Johnson received his Medal of Honor 86 years after his death. Many Harlem Hellfighters never received the recognition they deserved in their lifetimes. We owe it to people to acknowledge their contributions while they're alive to appreciate it. Fourth, progress is not linear. The 369th returned from war to find America more hostile, not less. The violence of the Red Summer shows that progress can provoke backlash. We can't assume that achieving one milestone means the struggle is over. Fifth, telling the complete story matters. For decades, the Harlem Hellfighters were erased from history because their story was inconvenient for white supremacy. Whose stories are we erasing today? What uncomfortable truths are we avoiding? History should tell the whole truth, not just the comfortable parts. Finally, courage comes in many forms. The Harlem Hellfighters showed physical courage on the battlefield, but they also showed moral courage, continuing to serve a country that oppressed them, believing that someday America would live up to its ideals. That faith in America's potential, despite America's failures, is its own kind of heroism. The story of the Harlem Hellfighters is not finished. It's part of an ongoing American story. The struggle to make the promises of the Declaration of Independence and Constitution real for all Americans. The men of the 369th fought for democracy abroad while being denied democracy at home. That contradiction drove many of them to become civil rights activists. Their military service was not the end of their fight for justice. It was the beginning. Their descendants continued that fight. In the 1960s, veterans of World War II and Korea inspired by earlier generations of black soldiers, became leaders in the civil rights movement. In every generation, black veterans have used their service as a platform to demand the rights they fought to defend. Today, we're still grappling with many of the same issues. Systemic racism still exists in America. Black Americans still face discrimination, violence, and denial of rights. The fight the Harlem Hellfighters participated in, the fight for full equality, is not over, but their story gives us hope. They prove that courage, excellence, and determination can overcome prejudice. They showed that even when America fails to live up to its ideals, there are Americans who will fight to make those ideals real. They demonstrated that change is possible, even if it's slower than it should be. The Harlem Hellfighters didn't win full equality for black Americans, but they advanced the cause. They inspired the next generation. They showed what was possible. That's a legacy worth honoring. The 369th Infantry Regiment, the Harlem Hellfighters, were extraordinary soldiers who achieved remarkable things under impossible circumstances. They fought two enemies, the German Empire and American racism. They defeated one decisively on the battlefield. The other, they wounded but did not kill. They spent 191 days in continuous combat, longer than any other American unit. They never lost ground. They never had a man captured. They earned more French military decorations than any other American regiment. By any objective military measure, they were among the finest soldiers America ever produced. But their greatest achievement wasn't military. It was moral. They proved that black Americans were not inferior, not incapable, not unworthy of full citizenship. They made that argument not with words, but with actions, with blood, with sacrifice. They fought for an America that didn't yet exist, an America that would judge people by their character and abilities, not their skin color. They believed in that America, even when America didn't believe in them. They served that ideal even when reality fell far short. Their faith was not naive. They knew exactly how racist America was. They experienced it every day. But they also believed that America could be better, should be better, must be better. And they were willing to fight and die to push America toward that better version of itself. We honor the Harlem Hellfighters not by pretending that racism didn't exist or doesn't exist, but by acknowledging both their heroism and the injustice they faced. We honor them by telling the complete story, the glory and the shame, the triumph and the betrayal. Most importantly, we honor them by continuing their fight, the struggle they participated in, the struggle for equality, justice, and full recognition of black Americans' humanity and contributions is not over. Every generation must take up that struggle anew. The Harlem Hellfighters gave everything for an America that gave them almost nothing in return. But they gave it anyway because they believed in what America could become. We owe it to them to keep working toward that America. We owe it to them to remember their story. And we owe it to them to ensure that no American ever again has to prove their worth by dying for rights that should have been theirs from birth. The Harlem Hellfighters were heroes. Not just war heroes, American heroes. Heroes of the long struggle for justice. Heroes whose story must never be forgotten again. God damn, let's remember them. Thank you for watching this documentary about the Harlem Hellfighters. Their story is American history, the history we should have been teaching all along. If you found this documentary meaningful, please subscribe, and share. These stories need to be told and retold until every American knows them.